geek. I've often loved to figure out how things work and how mathematics work. And so you've heard the term, and by the way, science and religion has been far apart, right? For hundreds and hundreds of years. But we're at a generation and a time now that we know enough about science to actually see that science and religion, or science and spirituality, the things that we don't see, are coming together. And I'm going to show you and talk more about that. So you've heard about applied mathematics. You've heard about applied physics, right? I'm going to talk about applied love. So the symmetry of Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, basically saying energy is matter, and matter is energy. So if you can apply love, you can create positive impact. And positive impact can beget more applied love. So, do you guys believe that energy is in fact matter and matter is in fact energy? It's easier to believe it now, right? Because when you think about all the energy that we get on this earth, most of that is coming from the sun. The sun, right now as we speak, is taking matter, which is hydrogen atoms, and fusing them together to create massive amount of fusion energy. In fact, right now, every second that goes by, there's 600 billion tons of hydrogen being fused together to create the energy that's warming this earth today. And when that energy comes millions of miles and coming across space and hitting our planet, those leaves outside are absorbing that energy and then turning them into more cells, plant cells. And that energy became plant cells that became matter, that became the wood that's, we're around, that became material. So how did that energy become matter? And then matter then become energy again. We take that plant and we ingest it ourselves, and the animals ingest it, and that turns into energy that fuels our cells and every cell in our body. So that is very natural. These are now scientific facts. Hundreds of years ago, we had no idea that that's how it works. But today, we know very well that's how it works. And we also now know that the mind, the body, and the spirit are all connected under the universal laws. You did not know, that plants don't have to be educated on how to change energy, change sunlight into photosynthesis. So with these universal laws, we also know that the human body is based on these same universal laws. We are very diverse. There are 50 trillion organisms inside that make up each one of us. And these organisms basically, they make up our liver cells, our heart cells, our brain cells. And when you think about how the body works, how many of you guys know what a stem cell is? Okay, let me explain what a stem cell is for those of you who don't know. When our body and our body cells die, or when we get injured, well, they need replacement, need a new army. So there's this ready supply of stem cells that are produced in our spine mostly, and that those stem cells, when they're born, our cells were actually many of our cells were once just stem cells. It could be any cell in the entire body. Even though they're completely different cells, they could become any cell. They all have our DNA in it. And some of our stem cells, they discovered their purpose in life, just as Pastor M said, what problem they were supposed to solve. They discovered their purpose in life very early. They just come out of the bone marrow very early, boom, they say, I'm going to be a bone marrow cell. I'm here to help bone marrows. And then others, they go through a fortuitous journey, sometimes for a very long time, all the way up to the brain and become a brain cell. But it took a long time, and suddenly, miraculously, as they are traveling, they just discovered their purpose, and boom, they go and serve out their purpose. Well, the reason that I say that, and I'm going to come back with some of these analogies on how the body works under the same universal laws, we also are under the same universal laws. So the body serves you in many, many ways, and I'll come back to this. And how about the mind? Well, the mind actually affects the body very, very well. The mind is directly connected to the body, and most of us don't think that the way and what we think actually affects our health. It absolutely does. This is Elizabeth Blackburn. She's a 2009 Nobel Prize winner, and she had got a Nobel Prize because she discovered that within the DNA, there are these things called telomeres. These are the end caps, kind of like the shoelace caps at the end, and they're there to protect our DNA. And when those run too short, that's when the DNAs stop basically saying, it's time to die. It's the death of the cells, and it's the death of our body. We can't reproduce anymore. So what she experimented with is that when you have a positive mindset, she experimented with one group of women that had children that are disabled, and another group of women that had children that are disabled. And the only thing that she did was split up the two, with one that had a positive mindset in terms of positive view of the world, and then one that had a negative view of the world. The people that had the negative view of the world viewed it as, this is a burden, this is a problem, my child is a problem. The people that had positive views, they viewed their children as, this is an opportunity, this is my job to solve this child's problem. And when they went back and measured their telomere length, it was astonishing. Is that those who had a positive thinking mind saw it as they can solve a problem versus they have a problem. The telomere lengths were not only normal, but some of them were longer. So they're healthier, more vibrant. So your cells actually know what you're thinking. And it's your responsibility to govern how you think and how you perceive the world. So, by the way, sound familiar with the issues of this world? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about invisible things. Invisible things do exist, whether we believe it or not. Now, Maxwell, which is a famous mathematician, theorized that there was such a thing as electromagnetism. And in fact, he wrote an equation on it. But it wasn't until 50 years after that that Hertz did an experiment to see that you can use electricity to transmit through thin air and then receive it all the way on the other side using electromagnetic waves. Nobody has seen it, touch it. What is electromagnetic waves? So that led to the invention of the first radio, being able to receive and broadcast. So that invention of the radio, only 120 years ago, has electromagnetic waves been around since the birth of the universe? Yes, it's just humans didn't know about it, and we did not know how to apply that technology. So today, if you think about, this has only been 120 years, right? Today we can't live without it. It's transformed our lives. So we have used technology innovation because of curiosity. That curiosity turned into a problem solving, and it turned into a technology that has transformed our lives. What else is out there that we don't know about? What else that's invisible but actually exists? What if? What if we have an emotional radio that we can control? What if we have that emotional radio in us right now? Each one of us can feel the emotions of love. We can feel the emotions of hate. So I've been thinking about this, and I wanted to break it down and see if there is such a thing as an emotional radio. So when you think about an emotional radio, there are two spectrums. There's the spectrum of love. It doesn't matter which country you come from. Everyone even have a language, a specific word for love. You know it in your country. I'm just using the word love because it's the English language, but you have your own word, whether it's amor, whatever it is. But that's the same feeling. So that means we know it, we can feel it. We can also feel the opposite of love, what it is to have fear, to have anger, the dark places. In fact, today, we can actually measure in our brainwaves. We have the technology to be able to measure through MRI. This is called the default mode network, DMN. And when you measure this in the state of love, it fires very differently when you're in a state of fear or anxiety. So then, if you have a radio, and by the way, our radios, if we don't know about it, how can we control it? Most of the time, our radios are controlled by our circumstances or by other people around us. If somebody is positive that's inspiring us, we might feel love for the moment. But if something is negative happening, what happens? We get drawn right back to the other side. Our interpretation can very easily be drawn by somebody else's broadcast. So, knowing that we can actually control our own radio is a power. Knowing if you now have an instruction manual to your cell phone, and you can operate a cell phone, and you can control that radio, it's power. So, how do you take control? And why should you even center on love? Why? Why center on this channel over here? Why center on this channel? And what is the definition of love in the first place? So I'm going to talk a little bit about love and talk about the opposite of love as well. So love to me is just having a sense of purpose for something more than self. And it could be love for someone. It could be brotherly love. It could be love for something that's other than even our human species. It could be love for a passion, a joy. It could be love for doing something, your job, your work. I should say your work rather than your job. It could be love for nature. It could be love for life. And if there's life on this planet, then there's got to be lots of love in the universe. We're only part of it. So if love is the positive force, the source for creativity, the source of innovation, the positive source for growth, then that's why we should center on love. Now, understanding love is one thing. We should also shine the light on what the opposite of love is. The opposite of love, some people call it evil, but evil is so hard to explain. It's just nebulous. It's hard to put my finger on it. And in fact, some people, when you spell love backwards, it sounds like evil, right? But really, let's break it down. Let's make it easy. Evil is just rooted in ego, in self-identity, in all about me. And it's centering myself that I don't see myself as part of the universe, part of the world. So if that is love and ego, and by the way, ego, when you look at the nature of ego, that means ego is naturally selfish, naturally greedy, naturally jealous, naturally arrogant. Name any adjective that's negative, you can probably associate it with ego. So instead of the power of love, it's actually the love of power. So what this means, if you give it power, I'm going to now talk about power because there's two aspects of a radio. One is the frequency. We just talked about the frequency of love, the frequency of ego. Now I'm going to talk about the frequency, the power. When you give power to the ego, it breeds hate. It breeds fear. It doesn't matter what age, doesn't matter which continent, what race. This is Pol Pot in Cambodia that killed off 3 million people with his regime out of only 7 million people. 3 million out of 7 million. And you know about this guy? And you know about what happened in Rwanda? It doesn't matter where and when. It's the same principle. It's just giving power to ego. And this quote is something that I really appreciate because as I'm studying this quote basically talks about the combination of love, power, and justice. So it's important for me to actually dissect this a little bit more. It says, love without, or power without love, that means power with ego, right? Without love is with ego. Power with ego is reckless and abusive. But love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. So what is justice? Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. So how do we harness power with love? Defeat ego and defeat hate and defeat fear. How do you do it? You cannot defeat fear with fear. You cannot drive out darkness. Pushing out darkness in a dark room is very hard. You have to turn on the light. And the only way that you can turn on the light is you got to be centered on love. When you're centered on love, the light naturally shines on. It's actually naturally easy. We talk about this side of the equation is really just, what we call sin. Now, whether you've decided to actually do something, if your mind is already here, if you're sitting there doing nothing, the Bible says you're still sinning. That means your channel is on here. Whether you've done something or not, but your mindset is still on there. So recenter yourself on here. But not only do you recenter and center yourself on love, you have to do the next thing. Apply power. Turn up that volume. And then you can get things done. So, love with power equals passion. But passion, if you think about it, passion can be below fear. And the fear may not change. In fact, some places, some of your countries over there have massive amount of fear. It's way up here. So when passion is less than fear, nothing happens. There's no momentum. But as soon as passion is greater than fear, you now have momentum. And the greater it is, the more momentum, the more movement. And what is courage? Courage is just the ability to have passion above fear. Doesn't mean fear is going away, but your passion level and your amplitude is rocking. And you're able to achieve a lot more. And these are the things that I find every day, even as an entrepreneur, right? Are we going to run out of money? Are the customers going to do this? And this doesn't apply just to your job. It applies to everything that you do. Should I go and talk to that girl? Should I, go interview for that job? Whatever it is. But it's a muscle that needs exercise. You have to train. You have to train on how to operate your radio in order for you to be effective. And not only do you have to train, you should coach others and bring in more Jedis. Bring in more that can change the world. So this is a story about Bassam Rahman. He's a Palestinian that grew up with nothing else except for hatred for the Israelis, because he's in an occupied territory that he constantly thinks that the other side is the enemy. But that's all he knows. We talk about sometimes misinformation and misguidance. When you only have one perspective, that's the perspective that you have. When he was 17 years old, he found some grenades with some friends, and they threw the grenades over to some Israeli soldiers. Fortunately, nobody got hurt, but nonetheless, they were arrested, and he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And while he's in prison, he was beaten, and he was tortured. And he was being tortured. He actually thought about the people. He saw a Holocaust movie before, and he used to have this hatred of his captors, thinking that, I'm glad that the Germans were killing the Jews. Well, those thinking were still on the surface. But while he was in prison, he started to have a transformation internally. And he thought, I have a curiosity to find out who these people are that is making my people suffer. So he started talking to a prison guard. And they have very different views. They have very different beliefs. But nonetheless, the dialogue started, and they had that conversation. And from that conversation led to, wait a minute, maybe this person is not necessarily the person I thought he was. And same thing with the prison guard, started to see him in a different light. And as they have that exchange in dialogue, the prison guard started to become actually much nicer. He started to transform, and Bassam started to transform as well. And when he got out of prison, he started the Peace for Combatants movement to bring peace between those who were at war. They were the victims because of the misinformation in education. So from that point forward, he was passionate about building peace. But 2 years after he got out of prison in 2007, his 10-year-old daughter was shot and killed by an Israeli soldier. And he was deeply saddened. She just bought some candy, and before she could even eat that candy, in front of her school, it was not a protest, it was nothing. She was shot. He spent the next 4 years trying to prove the guilt of the Israeli soldier, but at the end, through multiple trials, still no conviction. However, he one day went to meet the soldier face to face. And he offered his own forgiveness. And he says, I know that you're a victim. You're a victim of this miseducation. You're a victim of your beliefs because you haven't seen what's on the other side. And through that dialogue, he continues to build peace today. So that's one person making a small difference. But on a larger scale, when you think about the differences that you can make as a country, think about what's going on in your neighbor, Rwanda. My friend and pastor was just there last week. I was supposed to actually be with them on a motorcycle trip to ride from Uganda to Rwanda. There were pastors over there that were, this is the 25th anniversary, as you know, since 94. And even though this has been the worst genocide in human history, with 1 million people died in 90 some odd days, and brutal torture between and atrocities between neighbors that had known each other, the reality was this was created not by the tribes themselves. There were no Hutus and Tutsis before the Germans and the Dutch, who occupied that territory. Says, well, how are we going to control this area if we don't have some enemies to pit against each other? So they define facial characteristics and define you're a Hutu, you're a Tutsi. And from there on, you now, if there's some problems, blame one tribe against the other tribe and go to the other tribe and say it's the other fault. And that way it's easier to maintain control. Well, then that belief system, there was no Hutus and Tutsis. If you do some DNA tests between the two, they're probably practically identical. But their belief that I'm a Hutu, I'm a Tutsi, that led to generations of war. Fortunately today, from the news that I just got last week, it says Rwanda's at a very, very different place. It's in fact one of the world leading places for how people view equality between women and men. There are no more Hutus and Tutsis that you cannot tell your children, I was a Hutu or I was a Tutsi. And that makes such a big difference, not to label. I wish we can do the same thing in the United States, not to label ourselves as Democrats or Republicans. It's crazy to have a little D or a little R right next to the elective members. Why? We're people. We're here to serve the same purpose. So those transformation as a nation that's happening right now in Rwanda, and they're learning how to govern better so that not one dominant tribe or dominant political party can make decisions. In fact, if you win the election as a party, you can only have 51%, and the other 49% belongs to others. And for you to make a new law, you got to have 75%. So that ensures that there is some level of equality, but they're learning. This is through innovation, through necessity of innovation. Life is a journey. You're on a journey, I'm on a journey. So you cannot get to a good place in a bad way. You cannot go and solve the problems in the wrong channel. You have to solve it in the right channel. In fact, one of the things that I would say is, whether you succeed or you don't succeed, the fact that you've started this journey, and you've started this journey for others that will follow you. Focus not on the outcome. Focus on the process. So if you want to win the World Series, the World Cup, don't worry about, I'm going to win the World Cup. No, just focus on how you kick the ball, how you pass the ball. And enjoy it, love the game. As Robert says, about loving the game. So if you're in that place, when your radio station is dialed into love, you do have inner peace. Robert talked about inner peace. That's where you should stay. And don't worry about the outcome. There was a story earlier about the farmer and the horse. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, it's just your interpretation of good or bad. Just center on love. So with this journey, it's a journey of continuous improvement. You have to do your Jedi training to improve our habits. And by the way, now that you know that you are the CEO of 50 trillion individual organisms in your body, do you have a responsibility? Do you have a responsibility to take care of your people? What you eat, how you drink, how you sleep, and how you think. So those are your habits that leads to your work, your relationships. And then always be learning, always be growing. Plan, do, check, adjust. And the great things about babies, when you're a child, you don't know failure. You're not afraid of failure. As we become adults, we start becoming afraid of failure. Children, look at the way they learn how to walk. They crawl, they get up, they fall, they take their step, they fall. They take 2 steps, they fall, they get up, they get up, they get up, until they learn. And that's how we should learn. Is my radio station always going to be dialed into love? No. I'm going to find myself, catch myself all the time. But don't worry. Just recenter. Take a deep breath. Gratitude. Embrace our diversity. We're greater as a whole society. We're greater than that. And when you apply love, we talked about equipping you guys with some knowledge on how you do it, right? Now that you know, okay, there's a radio, how do we control our radio? Well, the first thing you do is, when you're in a situation of conflict, don't react. Before you react, ask 2 questions. Pause for a moment. Pause and ask 2 questions. Number 1, is my perspective of this situation, is it true? Is that person really calling me, this? Is that person really meaning this? Can I see it from their perspective? So number 1 is pause and ask if it's true. The second thing is, is my reaction going to be helpful? Is what I'm about to say going to be helpful? If it's not, earlier we talked about being strategic, right? Strategic with your response. You may be passionate, but sometimes that's a dumb thing to do because it gets you put in jail. So ask those questions first at that moment of choice. Take a deep breath with gratitude. And when you can take a deep breath and you center yourself and you have gratitude, the last thing is apply power. Sometimes the situation requires you to be intelligent and not act, but you're still applying power on how you're thinking without even acting. But other times, it requires you to speak up. You have courage, even though that there is a situation of fear. And at that time, when you're centered, it's easier to apply power. So those are the 2 things, simple things to equip yourself with, arm yourself with new weapons, and start applying from within. Because earlier you said, hey, I have my own problems. Me too. I have problems too. Every day. We all do. But start applying inside, applying it within yourself. You cannot apply it outside until you start from the inside. Then apply love to your community. One person at a time. One person at a time. And then when we can have consciousness of this as individuals and then as groups, then you can talk about applying love to something that's greater. Because we're not living here just about the human species. We now, once we can see that, hey, you know what? It's not just about human species. Look at the ecosystem. Look at what feeds us, clean water, plants, the entire earth. We're all part of it. We have a responsibility. But when man thinks that we're alone, and it's all about self, you can destroy the planet. Just like, what do you call a cell? Remember, we have 50 trillion of them, right? What do you call a cell that only thinks about itself and it doesn't know that it has a purpose? All it does is consumes energy. In fact, it affects the other cells around it, so that you have a bunch of cells that, effectively cluster together that think it's only about them. They consume the energy, and the energy is not given to some of the other cells that are out there. What do you call that? Cancer. They don't know. And cancer will destroy the host and destroy the body because they don't know. We don't want to destroy our host. Now we know. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Will. I think we're going